Picture this. A young German princess, barely speaking Russian, arrives at the glittering yet treacherous court of St. Petersburg in 1744. Within 18 years, she will orchestrate one of history's most audacious coups, topple her own husband from the throne, and transform herself into Catherine the Great, the woman who would expand Russia to unprecedented heights and drag a medieval empire, kicking and screaming, into the modern age. But how does an outsider become the most powerful ruler in Europe? How does a nation of serfs and scattered settlements become a continental superpower? And what price did millions pay for one woman's grand vision of enlightened despotism? Welcome to the extraordinary story of Catherine II of Russia, a tale of ambition, intellect, and ruthless political calculation that reads like the most dramatic fiction, yet shaped the destiny of the world's largest country. From the frozen steppes of Siberia to the warm waters of the Black Sea, from the philosophical salons of Paris to the blood-soaked battlefields of the Ottoman frontier, this is the story of how one remarkable woman seized absolute power and wielded it to transform Russia forever. Over the next hour, we'll journey through palace conspiracies and peasant revolts, military triumphs and cultural revolutions, as we uncover the methods, motivations, and lasting impact of Catherine the Great's extraordinary reign. Prepare to witness the birth of modern Russia through the eyes of its most formidable empress. Chapter 1. The Making of an Empress. The year is 1744, and a 14-year-old German princess named Sophie Friedrich August steps off her carriage onto Russian soil, her breath forming clouds in the bitter Moscow winter. She has no idea that she is about to embark on one of history's most remarkable transformations, from minor German nobility to the most powerful woman in the world. Sophie arrives in Russia as the chosen bride for the future Peter III, grandson of Peter the Great. But this arranged marriage represents far more than a simple political alliance. The young princess finds herself thrust into a court where survival depends on wit, charm, and an almost supernatural ability to read the shifting currents of palace politics. The Russia she encounters is a nation caught between worlds, part European, part Asian, desperately trying to modernize while clinging to ancient traditions. The Romanov court of Empress Elizabeth is a glittering facade masking deep structural problems. Russia remains overwhelmingly agricultural, with over 90% of the population living as serfs, essentially slaves bound to the land. The nobility speaks French rather than Russian, preferring European culture to their own traditions. The military, while numerous, lacks the technology and training of Western European armies. The Orthodox Church wields enormous influence, often opposing the very reforms the country desperately needs. Into this complex world steps Sophie, who immediately grasps that success requires complete reinvention. She throws herself into learning Russian with an intensity that impresses even her critics. While her future husband Peter openly mocks Russian customs and dreams of returning to his beloved Holstein, Sophie embraces her new homeland with calculated enthusiasm. She studies Orthodox theology, learns court etiquette, and begins cultivating relationships with key nobles and clergymen. The transformation begins with her name. Sophie becomes Catherine, symbolically shedding her German identity for a Russian one. But this surface change masks a deeper psychological evolution. The young princess develops an almost chameleon-like ability to present different faces to different audiences, pious and traditional with the clergy, sophisticated and European with foreign diplomats, accessible and caring with common people. Catherine's conversion to Russian Orthodoxy in 1744 marks a crucial turning point. While purely political in motivation, the ceremony demonstrates her commitment to her adopted country in ways that will later prove essential to her legitimacy. Unlike her husband, who makes no secret of his Lutheran sympathies and pro-Prussian sentiments, Catherine positions herself as more Russian than many Russians. Her marriage to Peter in 1745 proves to be a disaster on every level. Peter is immature, obsessed with military toys and Holstein politics, and apparently incapable of consummating their marriage. For years, Catherine endures public humiliation while privately educating herself in philosophy, history, and statecraft. She devours the works of Voltaire, Montesquieu, and other Enlightenment thinkers, developing the intellectual framework that will later guide her reforms. The court becomes Catherine's university, teaching her lessons no formal education could provide. She watches Empress Elizabeth navigate the treacherous waters of European diplomacy during the 7 Years' War. She observes how Russian nobles can be motivated, manipulated, and managed. Most importantly, she learns that in Russia, personal relationships often matter more than formal institutions. Catherine's first pregnancy in 1752 finally produces an heir, Paul, though rumors persist about the child's true paternity. What matters more than gossip is that motherhood enhances Catherine's position while simultaneously creating new vulnerabilities. She now has something to protect beyond her own ambitions and potential enemies who might use her son against her. The 1750s see Catherine evolving from a naive German princess into a sophisticated political operator. She builds networks of supporters among guards officers, court nobles, and Orthodox clergy. Her lovers, including Sergei Saltykov and later Grigory Orlov, are chosen as much for their political connections as their personal attractions. Every relationship serves the larger project of positioning herself for the moment when opportunity might arise. Elizabeth's death in January 1762 brings Peter III to the throne and Catherine as fate to a crucial juncture. The new emperor immediately demonstrates his unfitness to rule, alienating the military by ending the successful war against Prussia, offending the church by threatening to secularize monastery lands, and horrifying the nobility with his crude Germanic mannerisms and open contempt for Russian traditions. Within months, Catherine faces a stark choice: accept permanent marginalization under an increasingly erratic husband who shows signs of planning to divorce her, or risk everything in a desperate gamble for power. The decision, when it comes, will transform not just her own destiny, but the entire trajectory of Russian history. As 1762 progresses, Catherine begins laying the groundwork for what will become one of history's most successful palace coups. She cultivates relationships with key guards regiments, positions loyal supporters in crucial roles, and carefully monitors her husband's growing unpopularity. The stage is set for a confrontation that will determine whether Russia continues its halting progress toward modernization or slides back into provincial irrelevance. The German princess, who arrived in Moscow 18 years earlier, no longer exists. In her place stands a woman who has mastered the art of Russian power politics, absorbed the lessons of Enlightenment philosophy, and developed an unshakable conviction that she alone possesses the vision and strength to transform the world as largest empire. The only question remaining is whether she will have the courage to seize her moment when it arrives. Chapter 2. The coup that changed everything dawn breaks over St. Petersburg on July 9, 1762, and Catherine awakens to discover that her world has irrevocably changed overnight. Alexei Orlov, brother of her lover Grigory, bursts into her chambers at the Peterhof Palace with urgent news. The conspiracy is in motion. Peter III suspects nothing, and the time for half measures has passed. Within hours, Catherine must either claim the throne of Russia or face exile, imprisonment, or death. The events leading to this moment have unfolded with the inexorable logic of Greek tragedy. Peter III's 6-month reign has been a masterclass in political self-destruction. His decision to abandon Russia has hard-won gains in the 7 Years' War and ally with Frederick the Great of Prussia, the very enemy Russian soldiers have been dying to defeat, sends shockwaves through the military establishment. His threats to reform the Orthodox Church and force Russian troops to adopt Prussian-style uniforms and tactics, complete his transformation. From legitimate emperor to dangerous liability, Catherine has spent months carefully cultivating the conspirators who now risk everything for her cause. The plot centers on the Preobrazhensky and Semenovsky Guards regiments, elite units whose loyalty traditionally determines the fate of Russian rulers. These soldiers, many of whom have served since Elizabeth's reign, view Peter's pro-Prussian policies as nothing short of treason. Catherine's task has been to convince them that she represents legitimate Russian interests against a ruler who seems more German than the German princes he married. The conspiracy involves remarkable coordination across St. Petersburg's military and civilian elite. Guards officers like the Orlov brothers provide muscle and legitimacy. Court nobles offer financial resources and bureaucratic expertise. Orthodox clergy contribute spiritual sanction and popular support. Foreign diplomats, particularly the French ambassador, provide crucial intelligence about Peter's plans and international backing for Catherine's cause. As morning progresses, Catherine travels from Peterhof to St. Petersburg with a small but growing entourage. At each stop, more supporters join the procession. The Kazan Cathedral becomes the focal point for her legitimacy claim, as Orthodox priests conduct a ceremony recognizing her as rightful empress and her son Paul as heir. This religious endorsement proves crucial in a society where divine approval still matters more than constitutional law. The speed of Peter's collapse astounds even Catherine's supporters. By afternoon, the emperor who commanded the world's largest army finds himself effectively powerless, abandoned by virtually every institution of Russian government. His decision to flee to the fortress of Kronstadt backfires when the naval base's commanders declare for Catherine. Within 24 hours, a coup that could have triggered civil war instead achieves an almost bloodless transfer of power. Peter's surrender at Arnenbaum marks the end of the old regime and the beginning of Catherine's extraordinary reign. The deposed emperor signs an abdication document that portrays his removal as voluntary, recognition of Catherine's superior qualifications to rule. This legal fiction, however transparent, provides a veneer of constitutional legitimacy that Catherine will carefully maintain throughout her reign. The immediate aftermath of the coup reveals Catherine's political genius in action. Rather than conducting the brutal purges that typically follow palace revolutions, she demonstrates remarkable clemency toward potential enemies. She rewards supporters generously, but avoids creating a reign of terror that might destabilize her new government. The message is clear. Cooperation will be rewarded, but opposition will be futile. Peter's death in custody 8 days later eliminates the last threat to Catherine's legitimacy, while simultaneously creating her first major scandal. Official reports claim the former emperor died of hemorrhoidal colic, but rumors of murder persist throughout her reign. Whether Catherine ordered, approved, or merely tolerated her husband's elimination remains one of history's enduring mysteries. What matters politically is that his death removes any possibility of counter-revolution while demonstrating the new empress's ruthless pragmatism. The international reaction to Catherine's coup provides an early test of her diplomatic skills. European courts initially view her as an illegitimate usurper, expecting her reign to collapse within months. Frederick the Great, who had counted on Peter's alliance, dismisses her as merely a woman incapable of managing Russian power. These early miscalculations will prove costly as Catherine systematically outmaneuvers her critics on the international stage. Catherine's first public appearances as empress showcase the theatrical skills that will characterize her entire reign. She appears before cheering crowds in specially designed Russian dress, emphasizing her adoption of national costume over German fashion. Her speeches invoke the memory of Peter the Great and Elizabeth, positioning her reign as a restoration of authentic Russian values rather than a foreign usurpation. The new empress immediately begins implementing policies designed to consolidate her power and address Russia's most pressing problems. She reverses Peter's pro-Prussian foreign policy, restoring Russia's traditional alliance system. She demonstrates respect for Orthodox traditions while quietly pursuing Enlightenment-inspired reforms. Most importantly, she launches a systematic campaign to win the loyalty of key constituencies, nobles, clergy, merchants, and military officers, who can either support or undermine her rule. The success of Catherine's coup transforms not just Russia, but the entire European balance of power. A nation that is destined for decline under Peter III suddenly emerges as an increasingly formidable force under his widow's leadership. European diplomats scrambled to adjust their strategies as they realized that the German princes they had, dismissed as a temporary aberration, possesses both the will and the skill to rule the world's largest empire. Catherine's triumph also establishes a new model of female political power in an age dominated by male rulers. Unlike Elizabeth, who inherited her throne through dynastic succession, Catherine sees power through her own political maneuvering. Her example will inspire and terrify European courts for decades, demonstrating that exceptional women can transcend the limitations traditionally imposed by gender and birth. As 1762 draws to a close, Catherine has accomplished something remarkable. She has not merely survived a palace coup, but transformed it into the foundation for one of history's most successful reigns. The German princes who arrived in Russia 18 years earlier as a political pawn has become an empress, commanding the loyalty of 20 million subjects and the respect of European capitals. The real work, however, is just beginning. Seizing power proves far easier than exercising it effectively. Catherine now faces the enormous challenge of transforming her personal triumph into lasting institutional change, her individual vision into national transformation. The next 3 decades will test whether her remarkable political skills can overcome the enormous obstacles facing Russian modernization. Chapter 3: Enlightened Absolutism in Action. The morning sun streams through the windows of Catherine's private study in the Winter Palace as she puts the finishing touches on what will become one of history's most ambitious legal documents. The year is 1767, 5 years into her reign, and the Empress is crafting her Nakaz, a comprehensive legal code designed to transform Russian society according to Enlightenment principles. As she writes, Catherine believes she's creating a blueprint for the perfect state, where reason and justice will replace tradition and arbitrary power. Catherine's Nakaz represents the culmination of years spent absorbing the ideas of Voltaire, Montesquieu, Beccaria, and other Enlightenment philosophers. This document, containing 655 articles, attempts to synthesize European intellectual currents with Russian realities. She envisions a legal system based on natural law rather than imperial whim, where even serfs possess certain inalienable rights and nobles serve the state rather than exploiting it for personal gain. The Empress's correspondence with Voltaire during this period reveals her genuine commitment to Enlightenment ideals. The French philosopher becomes not just an intellectual mentor, but a crucial source of international legitimacy, helping to rebrand Catherine from German usurper to enlightened reformer. Their letters, published across Europe, position Russia as a laboratory for progressive governance rather than a backward autocracy. Catherine's approach to reform demonstrates remarkable sophistication in understanding the relationship between ideals and power. Unlike Peter the Great, who imposed change through brutal coercion, she attempts to create consensus through consultation and persuasion. The Legislative Commission of 1767 brings together representatives from across Russian society, nobles, merchants, state peasants, even some ethnic minorities, to debate her proposed legal reforms. The Commission sessions in Moscow reveal both the promise and limitations of Catherine's enlightened absolutism. For the first time in Russian history, ordinary subjects can publicly criticize existing laws and propose alternatives. Merchants complain about noble trade privileges. State peasants demand protection from arbitrary taxation. Even some representatives dare to question the fundamental institution of serfdom. Catherine listens to these debates with fascination and growing concern. The philosophical principles she has embraced in theory prove far more complicated in practice. While she genuinely believes in legal equality and individual rights, she also recognizes that rapid change might destabilize the very foundations of her power. The empress, who reads Voltaire in the morning, must govern nobles and serfs in the afternoon. The Nakaz itself reflects these contradictions. Catherine boldly declares that all men are born equal and that punishment should reform rather than merely deter crime. She advocates for religious tolerance, educational expansion, and economic modernization. Yet she simultaneously avoids any direct challenge to serfdom, the institution that provides labor for noble estates and taxes for the imperial treasury. Catherine's reforms extend far beyond legal theory into practical governance. She systematically reorganizes provincial administration, creating a more efficient and responsive bureaucracy. The gubernia reform of 1775 divides the empire into manageable units, each governed by appointed officials responsible to St. Petersburg. This centralization increases imperial control while theoretically improving services for ordinary citizens. The empress demonstrates particular interest in urban development and commercial expansion. Her 1785 charter to the towns creates a legal framework for merchant self-government and commercial courts. She encourages foreign immigration, offering land and tax exemptions to Germans, Dutch, and other Europeans willing to settle in Russia. These policies begin transforming Russian cities from administrative centers into genuine commercial hubs. Education becomes another priority, as Catherine recognizes that enlightened governance requires educated citizens. She establishes the Free Economic Society to promote agricultural improvement and industrial development. The Hermitage collection grows into one of Europe's premier art museums. The Imperial Academy of Arts trains a new generation of Russian architects, painters, and sculptors who will create the visual symbols of her reign. Religious policy showcases Catherine's pragmatic approach to Enlightenment ideals. While personally skeptical of Orthodox theology, she maintains public devotion and supports church construction projects. Simultaneously, she quietly implements policies of religious tolerance, allowing Catholics, Protestants, and Muslims to practice their faiths freely. This balance between public orthodoxy and private tolerance becomes a hallmark of her governance. The secularization of monastery lands in 1764 demonstrates Catherine's willingness to confront powerful interests when necessary. By transferring ecclesiastical property to state control, she simultaneously reduces church political power and gains resources for social programs. The policy triggers significant clerical opposition, but ultimately strengthens imperial authority over religious institutions. Catherine's enlightened absolutism faces its greatest test in economic policy. She recognizes that Russia's agricultural backwardness limits both military power and social progress. Yet her attempts to modernize farming methods confront the fundamental obstacle of serfdom. Enlightenment economics emphasizes free labor and market incentives, principles incompatible with a system based on human bondage. The Empress approaches this dilemma through characteristically indirect methods. Rather than abolishing serfdom outright, she attempts to improve serf conditions through regulation and example. She prohibits the sale of serfs without land and limits noble rights to impose corporal punishment. On her own estates, she experiments with wage labor and profit-sharing arrangements designed to demonstrate alternatives to traditional bondage. International observers watch Catherine's reforms with fascination and skepticism. European intellectuals initially celebrate her as the philosopher queen they have long imagined. Voltaire proclaims her the Semiramis of the North, while Diderot accepts her invitation to visit, St. Petersburg and advise on educational policy. Yet as the limitations of her reforms become apparent, enthusiasm gives way to disappointment and criticism. The Empress's correspondence reveals her own growing awareness of these contradictions. To Voltaire, she maintains optimistic accounts of Russian progress toward enlightenment. In private communications with trusted advisors, she expresses frustration with the obstacles facing reform. The gap between Enlightenment theory and Russian reality proves wider than even her considerable intellect initially grasped. Despite these limitations, Catherine's early reforms achieve significant results. Imperial administration becomes more efficient and less corrupt. Urban commerce expands dramatically. Educational opportunities increase for middle-class families. Religious minorities gain unprecedented freedom. Most importantly, Russia begins developing the institutional infrastructure necessary for sustained modernization. The Legislative Commission's dissolution in 1768, ostensibly due to the Turkish War, but actually because of irreconcilable differences over fundamental issues, marks the end of Catherine's most ambitious attempt at consensual reform. The experiment demonstrates both the Empress's genuine commitment to Enlightenment principles and the practical impossibility of implementing them fully within existing Russian social structures. As the 1760s conclude, Catherine has established herself as Europe's most prominent practitioner of enlightened absolutism. Her reforms, while limited, represent genuine progress toward more rational and humane governance. Yet the fundamental contradictions between Enlightenment ideals and autocratic power remain unresolved, setting the stage for future conflicts that will test both her principles and her political survival. The Empress, who began her reign believing that reason could perfect human society, now understands that politics requires constant compromise between ideals and reality. This hard-earned wisdom will serve her well in the challenges ahead, as external wars and internal rebellions force her to choose between philosophical consistency and practical survival. Chapter 4: Conquest and Empire Building. The thunder of Russian cannons echoes across the Danube as General Peter Rynantsov's forces crush yet another Ottoman army in the summer of 1770. From her palace in St. Petersburg, Catherine receives dispatches describing victories that surpass even her ambitious expectations. The First Russo-Turkish War has transformed from a defensive conflict into a campaign of conquest that will reshape the balance of power across southeastern Europe and establish Russia as the dominant force in the Black Sea region. Catherine's decision to wage war against the Ottoman Empire represents a calculated gamble that draws on both strategic necessity and imperial ambition. The immediate trigger comes from Ottoman support for Polish confederates opposing Russian influence, but the deeper motivation stems from Catherine's vision of Russia as a great European power worthy of respect and territorial expansion. The Empress, who once absorbed Enlightenment philosophy, now demonstrates that even enlightened rulers must sometimes speak the language of force. The military campaigns reveal the transformation of Russian armed forces since Peter the Great's era. Under Catherine's leadership, the army has evolved from a poorly equipped mass of peasant conscripts into a professional fighting force capable of defeating European opponents. Innovations in artillery, engineering, and logistics give Russian commanders decisive advantages over their Ottoman counterparts, while improved training and discipline create an esprit de corps that sustains morale through brutal campaigns. General Alexander Suvorov emerges as the most brilliant of Catherine's military commanders, developing tactical innovations that will influence warfare for generations. His emphasis on aggressive offensive action, combined with genuine concern for soldier welfare, creates an almost unstoppable force. The victories at Kozlodze, Kinburn, and Fuksani demonstrate that Russian military reforms have produced not just larger armies, but qualitatively superior ones. Naval warfare in the Mediterranean showcases another dimension of Russian military evolution. Admiral Alexei Orlov's fleet, sailing from the Baltic to engage Ottoman forces in Greek waters, achieves the stunning victory of Chessman in 1770. This triumph establishes Russian naval power in the Mediterranean while simultaneously inspiring Orthodox populations throughout the Ottoman Empire to view Catherine as their potential liberator. The Empress's War aims extend far beyond traditional territorial acquisition to encompass a complete restructuring of southeastern European politics. The Greek project, developed in collaboration with Austrian Emperor Joseph II, envisions the restoration of Orthodox Christian rule in Constantinople and the creation of a new Byzantine Empire under Russian protection. While ultimately unrealistic, this ambitious vision demonstrates Catherine's growing confidence in Russian power and her own imperial destiny. Catherine's management of the war effort reveals her mastery of both military strategy and domestic politics. She carefully balances the demands of military campaigns with the need to maintain noble support and prevent popular unrest. The Empress understands that external victories mean nothing if they trigger internal collapse, a lesson learned from observing other European rulers who bankrupted their states pursuing military glory. The Treaty of Kuchuk-Kainarji in 1774 represents one of history's most successful diplomatic conclusions to a military campaign. Catherine's negotiators, led by General Peter Rumyantsov, extract concessions that fundamentally alter the regional balance of power. Russia gains control of the Sea of Azov, the right to navigate the Black Sea, and protectorate status over Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire. Most importantly, the treaty establishes Russia as the dominant power in the Black Sea region. The annexation of Crimea in 1783 completes Catherine's transformation of Russian strategic position. This controversial decision, implemented despite Ottoman protests and European diplomatic pressure, provides Russia with its first warm-water naval bases and eliminates the last major Tatar stronghold threatening southern borders. Grigory Potemkin's administration of the newly acquired territory demonstrates Russian capacity for integrating diverse populations while developing previously underutilized regions. Catherine's partnership with Potemkin during this period showcases the Empress's ability to combine personal relationships with strategic planning. Their romantic involvement evolves into a political alliance that proves essential to Russian expansion in the south. Potemkin's vision of developing new Russia through immigration, urban construction, and economic development complements Catherine's imperial ambitions while creating lasting benefits for the empire. The Second Russo-Turkish War 1787–1792 tests whether Russian gains from the first conflict can be maintained against renewed Ottoman resistance supported by European allies. This time, Catherine faces a more formidable coalition as Austria provides limited support while Prussia and Britain actively encourage Ottoman resistance. The conflict becomes a struggle not just for territorial control, but for Russia's claim to great power status. Military campaigns during the Second War demonstrate the continued evolution of Russian military capabilities. The siege of Oshakov and the storming of Izmail showcase new levels of coordination between army and navy units. Suvorov's crossing of the Danube and advance toward Constantinople bring Russia closer than ever to achieving the ultimate prize of the Greek project. International diplomatic pressure ultimately forces Catherine to moderate her war aims, but the Treaty of Yassy in 1792 still confirms Russian dominance in the Black Sea region. The Empress, who began her reign as an uncertain usurper, now commands respect as the ruler of Europe's most rapidly expanding empire. Russian borders extend from the Baltic to the Black Sea, from Poland to Alaska, encompassing territories and populations that dwarf most European states. The human cost of Catherine's wars remains largely hidden from contemporary European observers, but shapes the empire's development for generations. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers die in campaigns across the Danube and around the Black Sea. civilian populations endure displacement, taxation, and conscription that transform traditional ways of life. The Empress, who reads Voltaire on human rights, simultaneously presides over military campaigns that create enormous suffering. Economic consequences of the wars prove more positive for Russian development. Control of the Black Sea opens new trade routes that connect Russian agriculture with Mediterranean markets. The annexation of Crimea and southern Ukraine adds fertile agricultural land that will become the empire's breadbasket. Military spending stimulates domestic manufacturing, while successful campaigns enhance Russia's international credit rating. Catherine's wars also accelerate social and cultural changes within the empire. Military service creates opportunities for advancement that bypass traditional class barriers. Exposure to foreign territories and populations broadens Russian perspectives on governance and development. The integration of Crimean Tatars, Greek merchants, and Armenian artisans into the empire creates new models of multi-ethnic cooperation. The Empress's correspondence during the war years reveals her evolution from cautious reformer to confident imperial strategist. Early letters express anxiety about military outcomes and international reactions. Later communications demonstrate growing conviction that Russia deserves recognition as Europe's largest and most powerful state. The German princess, who once worried about her legitimacy, now speaks as the equal of any European monarch. European reactions to Russian expansion range from grudging admiration to barely concealed alarm. British observers recognize that Catherine's victories fundamentally alter the balance of power in southeastern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. French diplomats struggle to maintain traditional anti-Russian alliances as the Empress's military successes make opposition increasingly futile. As the 1780s conclude, Catherine has achieved something unprecedented in Russian history: the creation of a genuinely imperial state capable of projecting power across multiple continents. The empire now stretches from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea, from Central Europe to the Pacific, encompassing territories and populations that make Russia by far the world's largest state. The military victories that establish Catherine's international reputation also create new challenges for imperial governance. Managing newly acquired territories requires administrative innovations and financial resources that strain existing systems. The empress who conquered an empire must now demonstrate whether she possesses the vision and skill necessary to govern it effectively. Chapter 5: The Pugachev Rebellion and its Aftermath. In the frozen wasteland near Orenburg, a man claiming to be Emperor Peter III rallies desperate Cossacks, runaway serfs, and discontented minorities to his banner. The year is 1773, and Yemlian Pugachev's rebellion threatens to tear apart Catherine's carefully constructed empire from within, just as her armies triumph against the Ottomans abroad. This massive uprising will test every aspect of the Empress's governance, while revealing the enormous social tensions that her enlightened reforms have failed to address. Pugachev emerges from the marginalized world of the Don Cossacks, those frontier warriors whose traditional freedoms have been steadily eroded by imperial centralization. His claim to be the true Emperor Peter III, miraculously escaped from Catherine's assassins, taps into deep popular beliefs about legitimate authority and divine justice. In a society where the vast majority cannot read, oral traditions and folk beliefs often carry more weight than official proclamations. The rebellion's initial success demonstrates the brittleness of Russian imperial control beyond major cities and military installations. Pugachev's forces capture fortress after fortress along the Volga River, recruiting thousands of supporters who see him as their liberator from noble oppression and imperial taxation. His manifestos promise the abolition of serfdom, the elimination of noble privileges, and the restoration of traditional Cossack freedoms. Catherine's response to the rebellion reveals both her political sophistication and the fundamental contradictions of enlightened absolutism. While publicly dismissing Pugachev as a mere brigand unworthy of serious attention, she privately recognizes the revolt as the greatest threat to her reign. The Empress, who corresponds with Voltaire about human dignity, simultaneously authorizes brutal suppression of subjects demanding precisely those rights her philosophical heroes champion. The social composition of Pugachev's army illuminates the extent of popular discontent with Catherine's regime. Runaway serfs form the rebellion's backbone, but they are joined by factory workers, religious dissenters, ethnic minorities, and even some impoverished nobles. This coalition represents virtually every group marginalized by imperial modernization, suggesting that Catherine's reforms have created more grievances than they have resolved. Military operations against the rebels prove far more difficult than campaigns against foreign enemies. Pugachev's forces employ guerrilla tactics that neutralize Russian advantages in artillery and discipline. The rebellion's popular support provides intelligence networks and supply lines that conventional armies cannot match. Most troubling for imperial authorities, regular troops sometimes refuse to fight against rebels whose grievances they privately share. The psychological impact of the rebellion on Catherine proves as significant as its military threat. For the first time since her coup, the Empress faces subjects who reject her fundamental right to rule. Pugachev's claim to be Peter III directly challenges her legitimacy, while his promises to abolish serfdom expose the gap between her enlightened rhetoric and autocratic practice. The philosopher queen discovers that ordinary Russians judge rulers by their actions rather than their intellectual credentials. General Alexander Bibikov's initial campaign against the rebels demonstrates both the strengths and limitations of Russian military power when deployed against domestic opponents. Regular army units prove effective in pitched battles, but struggle to control territory once conquered. The rebellion's ability to regenerate forces and reoccupy abandoned positions forces imperial commanders to adopt increasingly harsh methods that alienate local populations. The rebellion reaches its climax in 1774 as Pugachev's forces advance toward Moscow, threatening the empire's heartland. Catherine faces her darkest hour as reports arrive of nobles fleeing their estates and peasants throughout Central Russia showing signs of unrest. The Empress, who has expanded Russian borders to the Black Sea, now confronts the possibility of losing control over territories that have been Russian for centuries. General Peter Panin's appointment to command anti-rebel forces marks a turning point in the imperial response. Unlike Bibikov, who attempted to combine military action with political conciliation, Panin adopts a strategy of total war against the rebellion and its supporters. His systematic destruction of rebel strongholds and brutal punishment of captured insurgents gradually shifts momentum toward imperial forces. The rebellion's eventual collapse results more from internal contradictions than imperial military superiority. Pugachev's coalition includes groups with fundamentally incompatible goals: Cossacks seeking traditional privileges, serfs demanding complete freedom, and minorities pursuing ethnic autonomy. As imperial pressure intensifies, these differences create divisions that destroy the movement's unity and effectiveness. Pugachev's capture and execution in 1775 ends the rebellion but cannot erase its impact on Catherine's reign and Russian society. The Empress, who once believed in the basic goodness of human nature, now understands that enlightenment must be imposed from above rather than emerging naturally from below. Her faith in gradual reform gives way to recognition that fundamental change requires either revolutionary upheaval or generational transformation. The government's investigation into the rebellion's causes produces insights that shape Catherine's subsequent policies. Official reports identify serfdom, arbitrary taxation, and religious persecution as primary sources of discontent. Yet rather than addressing these root causes, Imperial authorities focus on improving surveillance and strengthening repressive capabilities to prevent future uprisings. Catherine's charter to the nobility in 1785 represents her response to lessons learned from the rebellion. By guaranteeing noble privileges and exempting the aristocracy from corporal punishment and arbitrary taxation, she secures the loyalty of the social class most essential to imperial stability. This conservative turn abandons earlier experiments with legal equality in favor of explicitly hierarchical social arrangements. The rebellion's suppression requires new administrative structures designed to prevent future popular uprisings. The gubernia reform creates a more centralized provincial government with enhanced police powers and improved communication with St. Petersburg. Local officials gain new authority to monitor potential dissidents while reporting suspicious activities to imperial authorities. Religious policy also shifts in response to the rebellion's lessons. Many rebels had been old believers and other religious dissenters who viewed Catherine's regime as fundamentally illegitimate. The government's new approach emphasizes orthodox conformity while tolerating other faiths only within strict limits designed to prevent them from becoming focal points for political opposition. The international implications of the Pugachev Rebellion influence European perceptions of Catherine's regime for the remainder of her reign. Foreign observers who had celebrated her as an enlightened ruler now question whether Russian autocracy can be reformed without triggering revolutionary upheaval. The rebellion's scale and duration suggest that Catherine rules over a fundamentally unstable society held together only by force. Economic consequences of the rebellion prove severe and long-lasting. The destruction of property, disruption of trade, and diversion of resources to military operations cost the empire enormous sums. More importantly, the uprising demonstrates the economic vulnerability of a system based on coerced labor and arbitrary taxation. Catherine's subsequent policies prioritize stability over innovation, limiting economic development in favor of social control. The Empress's personal correspondence during and after the rebellion reveals her profound psychological transformation. Letters that once expressed optimism about human progress now emphasize the need for strong authority and gradual change. The idealistic reformer who began her reign believing in natural law and individual rights emerges from the crisis as a pragmatic conservative focused on maintaining order. Cultural memory of the rebellion shapes Russian society for generations. Nobles who lived through the uprising develop lasting paranoia about peasant violence and popular democracy. Government officials embrace surveillance and repression as necessary tools for maintaining civilization. Even ordinary citizens internalize lessons about the dangers of challenging established authority. As the 1770s end, Catherine has survived the greatest internal threat to her reign while simultaneously achieving unprecedented external victories. Yet the Empress who emerges from this dual crisis differs fundamentally from the enlightened idealist who ascended the throne 15 years earlier. The Pugachev Rebellion marks the end of Catherine the Great's faith in enlightened reform, and the beginning of her evolution into a more traditional autocrat focused on preserving power rather than transforming society. The rebellion's aftermath also establishes patterns of governance that will characterize the remainder of Catherine's reign and influence Russian political development for decades. The Empress, who once dreamed of ruling through reason and consent now, understands that imperial stability requires a delicate balance between noble privilege, popular submission, and state power. This hard-earned wisdom will guide her through the remaining challenges of her extraordinary career. Chapter 6: Cultural Revolution and the Birth of Russian Identity. The magnificent halls of the Hermitage shimmer with candlelight as Catherine hosts one of her legendary evening gatherings in 1780. European ambassadors mingle with Russian poets, German philosophers debate with Orthodox theologians, and French artists sketch portraits of Siberian nobles. This cosmopolitan salon represents Catherine's grandest achievement: the transformation of Russia from a peripheral kingdom into a cultural powerhouse that commands respect across the civilized world. Catherine's cultural revolution begins with a fundamental recognition that political power requires cultural legitimacy. The Empress understands that military victories and territorial expansion mean little if European intellectuals continue viewing Russia as a barbarian state temporarily blessed with competent leadership. Her systematic campaign to establish Russian cultural credentials becomes as important to her legacy as any battlefield triumph or diplomatic success. The Empress's personal passion for collecting art transforms into a state policy designed to demonstrate Russian sophistication and wealth. Her agents scour European markets for masterpieces, often outbidding established collectors to acquire works by Rembrandt, Rubens, and other masters. The Hermitage collection grows from a private imperial gallery into one of Europe's premier museums, symbolizing Russia's emergence as a patron of civilization rather than merely a consumer of it. Architecture becomes another vehicle for projecting Russian cultural ambitions. Catherine commissions palaces, public buildings, and urban planning projects that rival anything in Paris or Vienna. The collaboration between Italian architects like Giacomo Careggi and Russian craftsmen produces a distinctive imperial style that combines European sophistication with Russian grandeur. St. Petersburg's transformation during her reign establishes it as one of Europe's most beautiful capitals. Literature flourishes under Catherine's patronage as Russian writers finally develop confidence to compete with their European counterparts. Gavrila Derzevin's poetry celebrates imperial achievements while exploring themes of mortality and human dignity that resonate across cultural boundaries. Des von Wiesen's comedies satirize noble pretensions and social hypocrisy with wit that earns international recognition. These authors create the foundation for Russia's later literary greatness. Catherine herself contributes directly to this cultural renaissance through her own writing. Her plays, though hardly masterpieces, demonstrate that Russian rulers can engage seriously with artistic expression. More importantly, her massive correspondence with European intellectuals positions her as an equal participant in Enlightenment discourse rather than a distant admirer of Western achievements. Educational reform becomes central to Catherine's cultural project as she recognizes that lasting transformation requires institutional change rather than individual patronage. The establishment of the free economic society promotes agricultural and industrial innovation while encouraging intellectual exchange between Russians and foreigners. The Imperial Academy of Arts trains native artists capable of creating works that reflect Russian themes while meeting European standards. The Empress's approach to language policy reveals her sophisticated understanding of cultural politics. While maintaining French as the language of court culture, she simultaneously encouraged the development of Russian literature and scholarship. This bilingual strategy allows the nobility to participate in European intellectual life while fostering indigenous cultural traditions that distinguish Russia from other European powers. Religious art experiences a remarkable revival under Catherine's guidance despite her personal skepticism about Orthodox theology. She recognizes that church decoration and ritual music provide crucial links between elite culture and popular tradition. The restoration of monastery libraries and the commissioning of new icons demonstrate her understanding that cultural authority requires respect for existing traditions as well as innovation. Theater becomes a particularly important vehicle for Catherine's cultural ambitions. The establishment of the imperial theaters creates institutions capable of staging both European classics and original Russian works. Her own plays, while modest artistic achievements, serve important political functions by presenting imperial policy in accessible dramatic form. The theater becomes a space where different social classes encounter shared cultural experiences. Music and dance follow similar patterns of development, as Catherine imports European masters while encouraging Russian composers and performers. The establishment of court orchestras and ballet companies provides employment for native artists while entertaining international visitors. These institutions gradually develop distinctive Russian characteristics that contribute to the empire's cultural identity. Catherine's salon culture transforms St. Petersburg into a genuine intellectual center rather than merely a political capital. Her evening gatherings bring together diverse participants in conversations that span politics, philosophy, art, and science. Foreign visitors consistently report their surprise at encountering sophisticated intellectual discourse in a country they had expected to find barbarous. The Empress's relationship with prominent European intellectuals serves crucial diplomatic as well as cultural functions. Her correspondence with Voltaire, published across Europe, portrays Russia as a progressive state committed to enlightened governance. Her support for Diderot's Encyclopedia project positions her as a patron of learning and free inquiry. These relationships enhance Russian international prestige while providing Catherine with intellectual credibility. Scientific institutions also benefit from Catherine's cultural patronage, as she recognizes their importance for both practical development and international reputation. The Academy of Sciences expands its research programs, while the Imperial Library grows into one of Europe's major scholarly repositories. These institutions gradually attract foreign scholars, while training Russian scientists capable of contributing to international knowledge. Popular culture experiences more ambiguous changes during Catherine's reign, as elite preferences sometimes conflict with traditional practices. Her promotion of European fashions and customs creates growing gaps between noble and peasant cultures. Yet her support for folk arts and crafts demonstrates recognition that authentic cultural identity must incorporate indigenous traditions alongside imported innovations. Provincial cultural development receives increasing attention as Catherine understands that lasting transformation requires changes beyond the capital cities. The establishment of provincial theaters, libraries, and schools extends elite cultural opportunities to smaller communities. These institutions often struggle with limited resources and qualified personnel, but they represent genuine attempts to democratize cultural access. Women's cultural participation expands significantly during Catherine's reign, as her own example demonstrates female intellectual capabilities. Aristocratic women increasingly receive serious educations that prepare them for salon participation and literary careers. While gender restrictions remain severe by modern standards, Catherine's reign marks the beginning of expanded opportunities for educated women. The development of historical consciousness becomes another important aspect of Catherine's cultural project. Her encouragement of Russian historical research and writing helps create national narratives that justify imperial expansion while celebrating indigenous achievements. The careful balance between celebrating Peter the Great's reforms and honoring earlier Russian traditions becomes a model for subsequent historical interpretation. International cultural exchange accelerates during Catherine's reign as Russia becomes an active participant in European intellectual networks rather than merely a passive recipient of foreign influence. Russian scholars study abroad, while foreign experts work in Russian institutions. This exchange enriches Russian culture while contributing to European understanding of Russian achievements and potential. The Empress's cultural policies also serve important internal political functions by providing alternative sources of elite identity and ambition. Nobles who might otherwise focus exclusively on court intrigue or military advancement now have opportunities for cultural distinction. This diversification of elite interests helps stabilize the political system while encouraging intellectual and artistic innovation. Regional cultural development reflects Catherine's understanding that a successful empire must accommodate diverse traditions rather than imposing uniform standards. Her policies toward Ukrainian, Baltic, German, and Tatar cultures demonstrate pragmatic flexibility in balancing imperial unity with local autonomy. This approach creates lasting loyalties while avoiding the cultural conflicts that destabilize other empires. As the 1780s progress, Catherine's cultural revolution achieves remarkable success in transforming international perceptions of Russia. European intellectuals who once dismissed Russian achievements now compete for imperial patronage and recognition. The empire that Peter the Great dragged into European politics through military force now participates as an equal through cultural accomplishment. The long-term consequences of Catherine's cultural policies extend far beyond her own reign to shape Russian identity for generations. The institutions she establishes, the traditions she encourages, and the standards she sets create foundations for Russia's later emergence as a global cultural power. The German princes who once struggled to learn Russian ultimately becomes the architect of a distinctly Russian cultural renaissance. Yet tensions remain between Catherine's cosmopolitan aspirations and growing nationalism among her subjects. The French Revolution's impact on European culture will soon test whether her carefully constructed balance between indigenous traditions and international standards can survive the upheavals that lie ahead. Chapter 7. The French Revolution's Shadow. The morning of July 14, 1789, finds Catherine in her private study at Tsarskoye Selo, reading dispatches from her ambassador in Paris with growing alarm. The storming of the Bastille and the collapse of royal authority in France represent more than distant political upheaval. They threaten the very foundations of legitimate government that justify her own rule. The Empress, who once corresponded enthusiastically with French philosophes, now watches in horror as their ideas inspire revolutionary violence that could spread across Europe. Catherine's initial reaction to French events reflects the complex relationship between Enlightenment theory and autocratic practice that has characterized her entire reign. While philosophically sympathetic to demands for legal reform and individual rights, she recognizes that revolutionary democracy poses an existential threat to monarchical government everywhere. The French Revolution forces her to choose between intellectual consistency and political survival. The Empress's correspondence during this period reveals her growing disillusionment with Enlightenment optimism about human nature and social progress. Letters that once celebrated reason's triumph over superstition now emphasize the dangers of popular participation in government. The revolution's violence and chaos confirm her deepest fears about the consequences of weakening traditional authority structures. French émigré nobles arriving in Russia bring first-hand accounts of revolutionary terror that profoundly influence Catherine's worldview. These aristocratic refugees, many of whom she has known personally, describe the systematic destruction of everything she considers civilized about European society. Their stories of property confiscation, religious persecution, and political executions reinforce her conviction that revolution inevitably leads to anarchy and barbarism. Catherine's response to the revolution combines diplomatic caution with ideological opposition. While avoiding direct military intervention that might provoke French retaliation against Russian interests, she provides financial support to émigré forces and joins international coalitions opposing revolutionary expansion. This careful balance reflects her understanding that Russian security requires European stability without unnecessary military entanglements. The impact of revolutionary events on Russian domestic policy proves immediate and lasting. Catherine abandons remaining pretenses of consultative government and popular participation in favor of explicitly authoritarian control. The Legislative Commission's dissolution in 1768 now appears prescient rather than premature, demonstrating the wisdom of maintaining autocratic authority rather than encouraging democratic aspirations. Censorship tightens dramatically as the government attempts to prevent revolutionary ideas from reaching Russian audiences. Books, newspapers, and pamphlets undergo systematic review to eliminate content that might inspire similar uprisings. The Empress, who once celebrated free inquiry, now recognizes that certain ideas pose threats too dangerous to tolerate in a society built on social hierarchy and political submission. Educational policy also shifts in response to revolutionary dangers as Catherine recognizes that knowledge without proper moral guidance can produce destructive rather than beneficial results. Schools receive new emphasis on religious instruction and respect for authority, alongside traditional academic subjects. The goal becomes producing loyal subjects rather than independent thinkers capable of questioning established institutions. The revolution's religious dimensions particularly disturb Catherine, whose own religious skepticism never extends to challenging the Orthodox Church's social functions. The systematic destruction of French religious institutions and persecution of clergy demonstrate how revolutionary fervor can undermine the moral foundations essential to civilized society. Her policies increasingly emphasize Orthodox traditions as bulwarks against revolutionary contagion. Russian noble reaction to French events varies considerably, creating new divisions within the aristocracy that complicate Catherine's governance. Younger nobles often express initial sympathy for revolutionary ideals, particularly legal equality and individual rights. Older aristocrats, especially those with French cultural connections, react with horror to revolutionary violence and social leveling. Catherine must navigate these divisions while maintaining noble loyalty to her regime. The Empress's relationship with European intellectuals undergoes fundamental transformation as revolutionary events expose the practical consequences of Enlightenment theories. Correspondence with Voltaire's successors becomes increasingly strained as Catherine questions whether philosophical idealism can coexist with political stability. Many intellectuals' support for revolutionary changes alienates her permanently from movements she once championed. Economic consequences of the revolution prove significant for Russian development as the disruption of European trade creates new opportunities and challenges. Russian agricultural exports benefit from reduced French competition, while manufactured goods become more expensive due to commercial disruption. These changes accelerate Russian economic development while simultaneously increasing dependence on international markets. Military planning receives new emphasis as Catherine recognizes that revolutionary France might eventually threaten Russian interests directly. The army's expansion and modernization programs gain urgency as potential conflict with revolutionary forces appears increasingly likely. Her generals study French military innovations while preparing defenses against ideological as well as conventional warfare. The revolution's impact on serfdom creates particularly complex challenges for Catherine's governance. Revolutionary proclamations of universal freedom resonate dangerously with Russian peasants, despite government efforts to suppress such information. The Empress, who once contemplated gradual serf emancipation, now recognizes that any weakening of social controls might trigger revolutionary upheaval within her own empire. Polish developments provide an immediate test of Catherine's counter-revolutionary policies as the Polish Constitution of 1791 embraces many principles associated with the French Revolution. Her decision to intervene militarily in Poland stems partly from strategic concerns about Russian security, but also reflects ideological opposition to constitutional monarchy and popular sovereignty. The successful partition of Poland demonstrates her commitment to preventing revolutionary contagion. International coalition building becomes a central focus of Catherine's diplomacy as she recognizes that revolutionary France poses threats requiring coordinated European response. Her negotiations with Austria, Prussia, and Britain aim to create effective resistance to French expansion while protecting Russian interests. These efforts establish patterns of coalition warfare that will characterize European politics for decades. The Empress's correspondence with other European monarchs reveals her role as a leading voice for counter-revolutionary resistance. Her letters to Marie Antoinette express personal sympathy while offering practical support for royalist causes. Communications with Emperor Leopold II and other rulers emphasize the necessity of united action against revolutionary threats to legitimate government everywhere. Cultural policy undergoes significant revision as Catherine attempts to inoculate Russian society against revolutionary ideas while maintaining her achievements in promoting arts and learning. Support for French cultural imports decreases dramatically while emphasis on Russian traditions increases. This cultural nationalism serves both defensive functions against foreign influence and positive goals of strengthening indigenous identity. The revolution's impact on Russian Orthodox theology proves particularly complex as church leaders struggle to reconcile traditional teachings about political authority with new challenges to established order. Catherine encourages Orthodox intellectuals to develop sophisticated defenses of autocratic government based on religious principles, rather than merely secular arguments. These theological developments influence Russian political thought for generations. Popular reaction to revolutionary events varies significantly across different regions and social groups within the empire. Urban merchants often express cautious interest in revolutionary economic policies, while rural populations remain largely unaware of foreign developments. Catherine's challenge becomes preventing revolutionary sympathies from developing among groups most likely to benefit from political change. The Empress's health begins declining noticeably during this period as the stress of managing multiple crises takes its toll. Contemporary observers note her increasing fatigue and occasional confusion during public appearances. The revolution's psychological impact on a ruler who once believed in enlightened progress toward human perfectibility proves as significant as its practical political consequences. As the 1790s begin, Catherine has successfully transformed herself from enlightened reformer into conservative defender of traditional authority. The French Revolution completes her evolution from German princess seeking acceptance to Russian empress determined to preserve the civilization she has spent decades creating. The idealistic intellectual who once dreamed of perfecting human society now focuses on protecting existing achievements against revolutionary destruction. The counter-revolutionary stance that defines Catherine's final years establishes precedents that will influence Russian policy toward European liberalism and democracy for the remainder of the imperial period. Her successors inherit both the benefits of her earlier reforms and the conservative instincts that revolutionary events have reinforced. The empress who began her reign embracing Enlightenment optimism concludes it defending traditional autocracy against democratic revolution. Chapter 8. The Potemkin Partnership and Southern Dreams. In the opulent chambers of the Winter Palace, Catherine reads Grigory Potemkin's latest dispatch from the newly conquered South with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. The year is 1787, and her most trusted advisor describes plans for magnificent cities that will rise from empty steppes, navies that will dominate the Black Sea, and agricultural colonies that will feed all of Europe. This grandiose vision epitomizes their extraordinary partnership, a collaboration between empress and statesman that will reshape the Russian Empire while creating one of history's most fascinating political relationships. Potemkin enters Catherine's life at a crucial moment in 1774, just as the First Turkish War concludes and the Pugachev Rebellion finally collapses. The Empress needs advisors who combine military competence with administrative vision, capable of both conquering new territories and transforming them into productive provinces. The one-eyed former guards officer who captures her attention possesses these qualities along with an almost supernatural ability to understand and implement her imperial dreams. Their romantic relationship, which begins almost immediately, evolves into something far more complex and enduring than a typical royal affair. Whether or not they actually marry in secret, as some evidence suggests, Their partnership transcends ordinary categories of personal and political association. Potemkin becomes simultaneously lover, minister, general, and alter ego, the masculine projection of Catherine's own imperial ambitions. The development of New Russia becomes the centerpiece of their collaboration and the laboratory for testing whether Russian civilization can expand beyond its traditional boundaries. The vast territories stretching from the Dnieper River to the Sea of Azov offer unprecedented opportunities for experimentation with new forms of governance, economic development, and social organization. Potemkin's administration of these lands demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of enlightened colonization. Catherine's southern strategy reflects her understanding that great power status requires economic as well as military foundations. The acquisition of warm water ports provides access to Mediterranean trade routes that could transform Russia from a primarily agricultural economy into a major commercial power. The Empress envisions grain exports feeding European markets while manufactured goods flow north to supply imperial needs. Potemkin's city-building projects represent the most visible symbols of this ambitious vision. Kherson, founded in 1778, becomes a major naval base and commercial center within a decade. Sebastopol, its magnificent harbor, accommodates the expanding Black Sea Fleet, while Ekaterinodar, later Dnipropetrovsk, emerges as a regional administrative capital. These urban foundations demonstrate Russian capacity for rapid development when resources and vision combine effectively. The colonization policies implemented in New Russia showcase innovative approaches to integrating diverse populations within the imperial framework. Potemkin actively recruits German, Greek, Armenian, and other foreign settlers while guaranteeing religious freedom and self-governance. This multicultural experiment proves remarkably successful, creating prosperous communities that remain loyal to the empire while maintaining their distinctive identities. Agricultural development in the southern territories proves equally impressive as fertile steppes previously used only for pastoral nomadism begin producing grain surpluses for export. Potemkin's encouragement of scientific farming methods and introduction of new crops demonstrate that Russian agriculture can compete successfully in international markets when properly organized and supported. The famous Potemkin villages controversy reflects both the achievements and limitations of Southern development policies. While some foreign observers claim that impressive settlements along Catherine's travel routes are merely theatrical facades designed to deceive the Empress, recent scholarship suggests that most developments were genuine, if sometimes hastily constructed. The controversy reveals European reluctance to acknowledge Russian developmental capabilities as much as any actual deception. Catherine's 1787 journey to Crimea represents the culmination of her southern ambitions and demonstrates the political importance of personal imperial presence in newly acquired territories. The elaborate progress through Ukraine and along the Black Sea coast showcases Russian achievements while reinforcing imperial authority among diverse populations. Foreign ambassadors accompanying the expedition gain first-hand exposure to Russian power and organizational capacity. The Greek project, developed jointly by Catherine and Potemkin, represents their most ambitious geopolitical vision and demonstrates how personal relationships can influence international strategy. Their plan to restore Orthodox Christianity to Constantinople and create a new Byzantine empire under Russian protection reflects both religious conviction and strategic calculation. While ultimately unrealistic, the project influences Russian policy toward the Ottoman Empire for decades. Military collaboration between Catherine and Potemkin proves essential to southern expansion, as conquest requires both strategic vision and tactical execution. His reorganization of frontier defenses and development of Cossack irregular forces create military capabilities specifically adapted to steppe warfare. The Empress provides resources and political support while Potemkin supplies military expertise and operational leadership. The Second Russo-Turkish War tests their partnership under extreme pressure as European powers attempt to reverse Russian gains in the south. Potemkin's defense of Ochakov and coordination of multiple military campaigns demonstrate his evolution from court favorite to genuine military commander. Catherine's unwavering support during moments of crisis reinforces their political alliance while maintaining public confidence in imperial leadership. Economic development policies in New Russia reveal the practical application of Enlightenment theories about commerce and social organization. Potemkin's encouragement of free trade, religious tolerance, and ethnic diversity creates prosperity that validates liberal economic principles while serving imperial strategic interests. These successes influence Catherine's approach to governance throughout the empire. The partnership's cultural dimensions prove as important as its political and military aspects. Potemkin's patronage of arts and architecture in the south creates distinctive regional traditions that blend European sophistication with local influences. His support for education and intellectual development produces a generation of southern Russian leaders, capable of continuing development after his death. Personal tensions within their relationship reflect the broader challenges of combining romantic involvement with political cooperation. Catherine's other romantic attachments, particularly her relationship with Platon Zubov, create jealousies that sometimes interfere with governmental efficiency. Yet their underlying political partnership survives these personal complications, demonstrating its fundamental strength and mutual benefit. International reactions to the Catherine-Potemkin partnership vary considerably, as foreign observers struggle to understand their unusual combination of personal and political elements. Some European diplomats dismiss Potemkin as merely an influential favorite, while others recognize his genuine administrative and military capabilities. These misperceptions sometimes provide advantages in international negotiations, where opponents underestimate Russian coordination. The partnership's institutional legacy proves more enduring than its personal dimensions, as Potemkin's administrative innovations outlive both participants. His integration of military and civilian authority in frontier regions creates governance models that Russian successors employ throughout the empire as subsequent expansion. The precedent of combining territorial conquest with systematic development influences imperial policy for generations. Catherine's relationship with Potemkin also demonstrates her sophisticated understanding of how to employ exceptional individuals within autocratic systems. Rather than viewing talented subordinates as threats to imperial authority, she recognizes them as essential instruments for achieving ambitious goals. This management philosophy enables her to attract and retain capable advisors throughout her reign. The Southern Territory's rapid development under Potemkin's administration validates Catherine's conviction that Russian civilization can expand successfully beyond traditional boundaries. The transformation of empty steppes into prosperous provinces demonstrates imperial capacity for creative as well as destructive achievements. These successes enhance Russian international prestige while providing foundations for future growth. Religious policies in New Russia reflect both Catherine's Enlightenment principles and Potemkin's practical political needs. The guarantee of religious freedom attracts diverse settlers while demonstrating Russian tolerance and sophistication. Yet the simultaneous promotion of Orthodox Christianity serves imperial interests by creating cultural links between new territories and the empire's historical core. Potemkin's in 1791 marks the end of one of history's most successful political partnerships and forces Catherine to confront the final challenges of her reign without her most trusted advisor. Their collaboration in developing the South creates lasting foundations for Russian power while demonstrating how personal relationships can serve broader historical purposes. The legacy of Catherine and Potemkin's Southern strategy extends far beyond their lifetimes to influence Russian imperial development until 1917. The territories they developed become the empire's most productive agricultural regions, while the precedents they establish guide subsequent expansion into Central Asia and the Far East. Their partnership demonstrates how individual vision and energy can reshape the destinies of nations and continents. Chapter 9. The Price of Progress. The harvest moon rises over a Ukrainian estate in 1785 as hundreds of serfs complete another day of back-breaking labor in their master's fields. These peasants, legally bound to the land and subject to their owner's absolute authority, represent the human foundation upon which Catherine's glittering empire rests. The empress who corresponds with Voltaire about human rights rules over 20 million people who possess fewer legal protections than livestock, creating a fundamental contradiction that will ultimately destroy the very system she works so hard to preserve. Catherine's approach to serfdom evolves throughout her reign as philosophical ideals collide with political realities and economic necessities. Her early writings express genuine sympathy for peasant suffering and recognition that forced labor violates basic principles of human dignity. The Nakaz includes provisions protecting serfs from the worst abuses while acknowledging their essential humanity. Yet these theoretical commitments prove impossible to implement without triggering the social revolution she desperately seeks to avoid. The Empress's personal estates provide laboratories for experimenting with alternatives to traditional serfdom without threatening the broader system. She introduces profit-sharing arrangements, wage labor, and educational opportunities that demonstrate enlightened management can benefit both landowners and peasants. These model communities attract international attention while carefully avoiding any challenge to the institution's fundamental legitimacy. Economic pressures intensify Catherine's dilemma as the empire's military expansion and administrative modernization require enormous resources that only serf labor can provide. The very wars that establish Russian great power status depend on agricultural surpluses produced by forced labor. Territorial expansion compounds the problem by bringing millions of additional peasants under imperial control, making gradual emancipation increasingly difficult to contemplate. The Pugachev Rebellion exposes the explosive potential of peasant discontent while demonstrating the practical impossibility of maintaining enlightened governance alongside systematic oppression. Rebel manifestos calling for serf liberation receive enthusiastic support throughout the empire, suggesting that Catherine's subjects understand the contradiction between her philosophical rhetoric and autocratic practice. The uprising's suppression requires methods that mock any pretense of enlightened rule. Legal codification efforts reveal the intellectual impossibility of reconciling serfdom with rational jurisprudence. Catherine's attempts to create systematic law codes found her on the problem of defining serfs' legal status. They cannot be property like livestock, yet cannot possess rights like citizens. This fundamental contradiction undermines her broader legal reforms while exposing the arbitrary foundations of imperial authority. The Charter to the Nobility in 1785 represents Catherine's ultimate abandonment of social equality in favor of explicit hierarchy designed to secure elite loyalty. By guaranteeing noble privileges while simultaneously expanding their authority over serfs, she creates a social contract based on mutual exploitation rather than enlightened governance. This conservative settlement provides stability at the cost of justice and long-term social development. Regional variations in serf conditions demonstrate the system's arbitrary and often brutal character despite occasional enlightened management. While some nobles adopt humane policies that improve peasant welfare, others exercise virtually unlimited authority over their human property. The lack of consistent legal protections leaves millions vulnerable to individual caprice while undermining any systematic approach to social reform. Economic development in serf-based agriculture proves increasingly inefficient compared to free labor systems emerging elsewhere in Europe. Forced workers lack incentives for innovation or productivity improvement, while nobles have little reason to invest in agricultural modernization when human labor remains cheap and abundant. This economic stagnation threatens Russia's competitive position in international markets. Educational policies reflect Catherine's recognition that knowledge threatens social control in a society based on systematic oppression. While expanding educational opportunities for nobles and urban populations, she carefully limits peasant access to literacy and learning. The Empress, who celebrates enlightenment for the privileged, simultaneously ensures that the majority remains ignorant of ideas that might inspire resistance. Religious justifications for serfdom receive increasing emphasis as Catherine seeks moral legitimacy for an institution that contradicts her stated philosophical principles. Orthodox theology's emphasis on social hierarchy and divine authority provides intellectual cover for practices that violate natural law. Yet even church leaders struggle to reconcile Christian teachings about human dignity with the realities of peasant bondage. International criticism of Russian serfdom intensifies during Catherine's reign as European observers increasingly condemn an institution they view as barbaric and economically backward. The Empress's correspondence with foreign intellectuals reveals her sensitivity to these criticisms while demonstrating her inability to address them without threatening imperial stability. Her defensive responses gradually alienate former admirers who expected enlightened reform. Population growth under Catherine's rule increases the absolute number of serfs while expanding the geographical scope of the institution. The annexation of territories like Crimea and eastern Ukraine brings additional peasant populations under imperial control, extending serfdom into regions that had previously known different forms of social organization. This expansion makes the institution more entrenched rather than facilitating gradual reform. Urban development creates new categories of unfree labor as Catherine extends serfdom into industrial and commercial activities. Factory serfs, household servants, and artisan workers experience different forms of bondage that demonstrate the institution's adaptability to changing economic conditions. These variations complicate any systematic approach to reform while creating additional constituencies with stakes in maintaining unfree labor. Catherine's final years witness growing awareness that serfdom poses an existential threat to imperial development and international standing. European military and economic innovations increasingly depend on free labor and citizen participation that Russia's social system cannot provide. The Empress, who once believed in gradual progress toward enlightenment, now recognizes that fundamental change requires revolutionary upheaval she cannot survive. Administrative efficiency suffers from the contradiction between enlightened governance and systematic oppression as officials struggle to implement rational policies in an irrational social context. Corruption flourishes when legal protections depend on personal relationships rather than institutional safeguards. The very administrative modernization Catherine champions becomes impossible to achieve within existing social structures. Military recruitment demonstrates serfdom's impact on imperial defense capabilities, as peasant conscripts lack the education and motivation of citizen soldiers. While Russian armies prove effective in conventional warfare, they increasingly lag behind forces composed of free men fighting for their own countries. This military disadvantage threatens the empire's great power status that justifies the social system supporting it. Cultural development reflects the broader contradictions of enlightened despotism as Russia produces remarkable achievements in arts and learning while denying basic humanity to the majority of its population. The same society that creates magnificent palaces and sophisticated literature systematically brutalizes millions of peasants whose labor makes such achievements possible. Women's experience under serfdom reveals gender dimensions of oppression that compound the system's injustices. Female serfs face sexual exploitation and family separation that male peasants avoid, while noble women exercise authority over peasants that contradicts ideals of feminine virtue. These gender contradictions expose additional moral problems with an institution that corrupts everyone it touches. Economic calculations increasingly demonstrate serfdom's inefficiency, as Catherine's advisors recognize that free labor produces greater wealth than forced work. Yet the transition costs and political risks of emancipation appear prohibitive to a regime dependent on noble support and peasant submission. The empress, trapped between economic logic and political survival, chooses stability over progress. The French Revolution's impact on Russian serfdom proves particularly complex as revolutionary proclamations of universal freedom resonate dangerously with peasant aspirations while simultaneously reinforcing Catherine's determination to prevent social upheaval. The empress, who once contemplated gradual reform, now views any change as potentially revolutionary, effectively freezing the social system in place. International comparisons reveal Russia's increasing isolation as other European societies move toward free labor, while the empire entrenches serfdom more deeply. This social backwardness threatens Russia's claim to European civilization, while undermining the very international standing that Catherine's reign has achieved through military and diplomatic success. As Catherine's reign concludes, serfdom represents both her greatest failure and her most tragic compromise. The empress, who genuinely believed in human dignity and social progress, proves unable to reconcile these ideals with the practical requirements of maintaining power in an autocratic society. Her successor inherits not just an expanded empire, but a social system whose fundamental contradictions will ultimately destroy the Romanov dynasty itself. Chapter 10: Diplomacy and the Balance of Power. The gilded halls of Versailles buzz with nervous energy in the summer of 1781 as European diplomats struggle to comprehend the new reality confronting them. Russia, once dismissed as a peripheral power of questionable European credentials, now commands respect as an equal partner in the continent's most crucial negotiations. Catherine's masterful orchestration of the Armed Neutrality Coalition during the American Revolutionary War demonstrates her transformation from German usurper to shrewd international strategist whose decisions influence the fate of nations. Catherine's diplomatic revolution begins with her recognition that military power without diplomatic legitimacy remains incomplete and ultimately fragile. The empress, who sees power through a palace coup, understands that lasting security requires acceptance by other European rulers as a legitimate member of their exclusive club. Her systematic campaign to achieve this recognition becomes as important to Russian development as any territorial conquest or internal reform. The Northern System, developed in collaboration with Count Nikita Panin, represents Catherine's first major diplomatic innovation and establishes the strategic framework that guides Russian foreign policy throughout her reign. This alliance network, centered on partnerships with Prussia, Poland, Sweden, and Britain, provides alternatives to traditional French and Austrian dominance while creating space for Russian expansion without triggering coalition warfare. Marriage diplomacy showcases Catherine's sophisticated understanding of dynastic politics and personal relationships in 18th century international relations. Her grandson Alexander's betrothal to an Austrian archduchess strengthens ties with the Habsburgs, while her support for various German princely marriages extends Russian influence throughout the Holy Roman Empire. These personal connections prove as valuable as formal treaties in securing strategic objectives. Commercial policy becomes an increasingly important diplomatic tool as Catherine recognizes that economic relationships often prove more durable than military alliances. The expansion of Russian trade with Britain, France, and other maritime powers creates mutual interests that survive political disagreements. Her promotion of grain exports and naval stores provides leverage in international negotiations while demonstrating Russian economic potential. The Polish question tests Catherine's diplomatic skills more severely than any other international challenge, as competing powers seek to exploit Polish weakness for their own advantage. Her successful management of Polish affairs requires delicate balancing between Austrian and Prussian interests while preventing French intervention. The eventual partition of Poland, while morally questionable, represents a diplomatic masterpiece that achieves Russian objectives without triggering European war. Catherine's relationship with Frederick, the Great of Prussia, evolves from mutual suspicion to grudging respect as both rulers recognize their common interests in preventing Austrian and French dominance. Their correspondence reveals two master practitioners of realpolitik, finding ways to cooperate despite fundamental disagreements about governance and society. This unlikely partnership provides stability in Central European politics while enabling both powers to pursue expansion. The Ottoman Empire presents Catherine with her greatest diplomatic opportunity and most dangerous challenge, as Russian expansion threatens to upset the European balance of power. Her successful management of two major wars against the Turks requires careful coordination with Austrian allies while neutralizing potential French and British intervention. The resulting treaties establish Russian dominance in the Black Sea region without triggering the general European war many observers expected. Revolutionary France creates entirely new diplomatic challenges as traditional alliance systems collapse and ideological considerations complicate strategic calculations. Catherine's leadership of the counter-revolutionary coalition demonstrates her adaptation to changing circumstances while maintaining focus on core Russian interests. Her ability to combine ideological opposition with pragmatic flexibility becomes a model for conservative resistance to revolutionary change. The armed neutrality during the American Revolutionary War represents perhaps Catherine's most brilliant diplomatic achievement, as she creates an international coalition that serves Russian interests while claiming to defend neutral rights. This initiative demonstrates how middle powers can influence great power conflicts through careful coalition building and moral leadership. The successful challenge to British naval supremacy enhances Russian prestige while establishing precedents for future maritime law. Territorial diplomacy reveals Catherine's mastery of the complex negotiations required to transform military conquests into legitimate sovereignty. Her success in securing international recognition for Russian annexation of Crimea, despite Ottoman protests and European concerns, demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how fait accompli can become accepted reality through patient diplomatic pressure and strategic concessions. Cultural diplomacy supplements traditional political and military tools, as Catherine recognizes that intellectual influence can be as valuable as territorial expansion. Her correspondence with European philosophers, patronage of foreign artists, and promotion of Russian cultural achievements create soft power that enhances formal diplomatic initiatives. This cultural offensive transforms international perceptions of Russia from backward autocracy to enlightened empire. Intelligence operations under Catherine's direction demonstrate early understanding of how information can provide decisive advantages in international competition. Her networks of diplomats, merchants, and intellectuals gather intelligence about foreign intentions while spreading favorable information about Russian achievements. This systematic approach to information warfare gives Russia advantages that purely military means could not achieve. Succession planning becomes an increasingly important diplomatic consideration as Catherine ages and European courts speculate about Russian stability after her death. Her careful management of her son Paul's relationship with foreign powers while maintaining her own authority demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how succession uncertainty can undermine diplomatic effectiveness. Alliance management proves particularly challenging, as Catherine must balance competing obligations while pursuing expanding Russian interests. Her simultaneous partnerships with Austria and Prussia require constant adjustment as these traditional enemies pursue conflicting objectives. The Empress's ability to maintain useful relationships with both powers without triggering their mutual hostility showcases diplomatic virtuosity. Economic diplomacy expands in importance as international trade becomes more crucial to imperial finances and development. Catherine's commercial treaties with Britain, France, and other trading partners create mutual dependencies that supplement political alliances. Her promotion of Russian exports while protecting domestic industries demonstrates understanding of how economic policy can serve broader strategic objectives, while building prosperity that enhances national power. Naval diplomacy emerges as a new dimension of Russian international influence as Catherine's Black Sea Fleet and Baltic squadrons project power into previously inaccessible regions. The presence of Russian warships in the Mediterranean during the Greek archipelago expedition demonstrates how naval capabilities can extend diplomatic reach while supporting political objectives thousands of miles from traditional spheres of influence. Mediation efforts showcase Catherine's growing international prestige as European powers increasingly seek Russian arbitration in their disputes. Her role in resolving conflicts between various German princes, her mediation attempts during the War of American Independence, and her influence in Balkan affairs demonstrate how successful powers naturally become centers of diplomatic gravity that smaller states orbit. The Greek project represents Catherine's most ambitious diplomatic vision and reveals both the possibilities and limitations of 18th century coalition building. Her partnership with Austrian Emperor Joseph II in planning the partition of the Ottoman Empire requires extraordinary coordination while managing the concerns of other European powers. Though ultimately unsuccessful, the project demonstrates Russian capacity for grand strategic thinking on a continental scale. Personal diplomacy proves crucial throughout Catherine's reign, as she recognizes that international relations often depend on individual relationships between rulers. Her careful cultivation of relationships with other monarchs, her strategic use of charm and intelligence in dealing with foreign ambassadors, and her mastery of diplomatic protocol create personal bonds that survive political disagreements and strategic competition. Crisis management becomes an essential diplomatic skill as Catherine faces numerous international emergencies that threaten to escalate into general European wars. Her handling of the Polish Confederation crisis, her response to Swedish aggression during the Second Russo-Turkish War, and her management of tensions with Britain during the armed neutrality demonstrate how skillful diplomacy can prevent local conflicts from becoming continental catastrophes. The balance of power concept evolves during Catherine's reign as Russian expansion forces other European powers to recalculate their strategic positions. The Empress, who initially sought acceptance within existing international structures, gradually becomes a power whose very success threatens traditional arrangements. Her challenge becomes managing Russian growth without triggering the coalition warfare that could destroy her achievements. Dynastic diplomacy remains important throughout the period as royal marriages and succession questions continue influencing international relations. Catherine's careful management of her family's matrimonial alliances, her intervention in various succession disputes, and her use of dynastic claims to justify territorial acquisitions demonstrate continued relevance of traditional monarchical politics alongside emerging state-centered diplomacy. Communication technologies and methods receive increasing attention as Catherine recognizes that effective diplomacy requires rapid and secure information transmission. Her development of diplomatic courier services, her use of commercial networks for intelligence gathering, and her careful attention to diplomatic correspondence security create competitive advantages in an era when information often determines policy success. International law and precedent become tools for legitimizing Russian actions while constraining potential opponents. Catherine's careful attention to legal justifications for territorial acquisitions, her citation of historical precedents for expansion, and her use of international arbitration to resolve disputes demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how legal arguments can supplement military and political pressure. European public opinion emerges as a new factor in international relations as literacy expansion and press development create audiences for diplomatic arguments beyond royal courts. Catherine's attention to her international reputation, her efforts to influence foreign press coverage, and her use of cultural achievements to enhance Russian prestige demonstrate early recognition of what would later be called public diplomacy. Colonial and maritime issues increasingly influence European diplomacy as overseas expansion creates new sources of conflict and cooperation. Catherine's involvement in American Revolutionary War diplomacy, her interest in Pacific exploration and trade, and her promotion of Russian commercial expansion demonstrate understanding that European politics now have global dimensions requiring worldwide strategic thinking. As Catherine's reign concludes, she has fundamentally transformed Russia's international position from peripheral kingdom to Central European power, whose decisions influence continental politics. Her diplomatic achievements rival her military conquests in establishing Russian great power status while creating institutional frameworks that will guide imperial policy for generations. The diplomatic legacy Catherine leaves extends far beyond specific treaties or territorial acquisitions to encompass new methods and principles that will influence international relations well into the modern era. Her demonstration that systematic diplomacy can achieve objectives that military force alone cannot accomplish becomes a model for subsequent Russian leaders facing the challenges of managing a continental empire in an increasingly complex international system. The Empress, who began her reign seeking international acceptance, concludes it as a diplomatic innovator whose methods and achievements command worldwide respect. Her transformation of Russian foreign policy from reactive opportunism to proactive strategic planning establishes foundations for the empire's continued expansion and influence throughout the 19th century and beyond. Chapter 11. Legacy of the Great Empress, November 6, 1796. Dawns cold and gray over St. Petersburg as Catherine the Great lies dying in her private chambers surrounded by the artifacts of a reign that has transformed not just Russia, but the entire European balance of power. The German princess, who arrived in Moscow 52 years earlier as an insignificant bride, has become one of history's most consequential rulers, leaving behind an empire that stretches from the Baltic to the Pacific, from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea, the largest continuous landmass ever governed by a single authority. Catherine's territorial legacy alone places her among history's greatest conquerors. Under her rule, Russia has expanded by over 200,000 square miles, incorporating territories that include Crimea, much of Ukraine's fertile steppes, substantial portions of Poland, and vast regions of what will become southern Russia. This expansion has not merely added land to existing domains, but has fundamentally altered the empire's character, transforming Russia from a primarily northern European power into a genuinely Eurasian empire with interests spanning 3 continents. The human dimensions of Catherine's legacy prove even more complex and enduring than her territorial conquests. She has governed over 20 million subjects at the time of her death, more than any previous Russian ruler, incorporating diverse populations that include Orthodox Slavs, Catholic Poles, Muslim Tatars, Protestant Germans, and dozens of other ethnic and religious communities. Her policies of religious tolerance and cultural autonomy create models of imperial governance that will influence Russian administration for centuries. Administrative modernization represents, perhaps, Catherine's most lasting institutional achievement as she transforms medieval government structures into recognizably modern bureaucratic systems. The gubernia reform creates provincial administration that survives with modifications until 1917, while her legal codification efforts establish principles of rational jurisprudence that gradually replace arbitrary autocratic rule. These institutional innovations provide foundations for the empire's continued development long after her death. Economic transformation under Catherine's leadership fundamentally alters Russia's international position, as agricultural modernization and commercial expansion create wealth that supports military power and diplomatic influence. Russian grain exports feed European markets, while the development of manufacturing creates domestic alternatives to foreign imports. The empress, who inherited a financially strained empire, bequeaths to her successors a prosperous state capable of sustaining great power responsibilities. Cultural achievements during Catherine's reign establish Russia as a genuine participant in European civilization rather than merely its eastern periphery. The Hermitage becomes one of the world's great art collections, while Russian literature, theater, and architecture achieve international recognition. St. Petersburg emerges as one of Europe's most beautiful capitals, rivaling Paris and Vienna in sophistication and grandeur. These cultural accomplishments create soft power that complements military strength in establishing Russian international prestige. Educational expansion during her reign creates the intellectual infrastructure necessary for sustained modernization, as schools, universities, and scholarly institutions train new generations of educated Russians capable of competing with their European counterparts. The free economic society promotes scientific agriculture and industrial development, while the Academy of Arts trains native artists who create distinctly Russian cultural traditions. These educational achievements establish foundations for the intellectual flowering that will characterize 19th century Russian culture. Military modernization under Catherine's direction creates armed forces capable of defeating any European opponent while projecting power across multiple continents. The army that conquers Ottoman strongholds and suppresses internal rebellions demonstrates tactical innovation and organizational efficiency that surpass most contemporary forces. The navy that operates in the Mediterranean and Pacific demonstrates Russian capacity for global power projection previously unimaginable. The contradictions and limitations of Catherine's reign prove as significant for understanding her historical impact as her achievements. Her failure to address serfdom's fundamental injustices creates social tensions that will ultimately destroy the imperial system she worked so hard to strengthen. The gap between Enlightenment rhetoric and autocratic practice undermines the moral legitimacy essential for lasting political stability. International influence during Catherine's reign establishes Russia as an indispensable participant in European politics whose approval or opposition can determine the success or failure of continental initiatives. Her leadership of the Armed Neutrality Coalition demonstrates how middle powers can influence great power conflicts through skillful diplomacy and coalition building. European courts that once dismissed Russia now compete for its alliance and fear its enmity. Religious policies under Catherine create lasting frameworks for managing the empire's enormous religious diversity while maintaining orthodox supremacy. Her practical tolerance allows minority communities to flourish while avoiding the religious conflicts that plague other European states. These policies establish precedents for imperial governance that survive throughout the Romanov period and influence Soviet nationality policies. Scientific and technological development accelerates during Catherine's reign as increased contact with European innovations combines with domestic experimentation to advance Russian capabilities in multiple fields. Geographic exploration expands knowledge of Siberian and Pacific territories, while agricultural science improves farming methods throughout the empire. These technological advances contribute to economic development while enhancing military capabilities. Women's roles in Russian society expand significantly during Catherine's reign, as her own example demonstrates female capacity for political leadership, while her policies create new opportunities for aristocratic women's education and participation in cultural life. While gender restrictions remain severe by modern standards, the precedents established during her reign influence subsequent developments in women's legal and social status. Urban development transforms Russian cities from administrative centers into genuine commercial and cultural hubs as Catherine's policies encourage trade, manufacturing, and architectural innovation. The growth of St. Petersburg, Moscow, and regional centers creates middle-class populations whose economic and intellectual interests gradually reshape imperial society. These urban transformations establish foundations for the empire's later industrial development. Legal reform under Catherine begins the long process of replacing arbitrary autocratic rule with systematic jurisprudence based on rational principles. While her legal codes remain incomplete and often contradictory, they establish precedents for legal equality and individual rights that will influence subsequent reform efforts. The principle that even autocratic power should operate within legal constraints becomes an enduring part of Russian political discourse. The personal dimensions of Catherine's legacy prove as complex as her public achievements, as she demonstrates how exceptional individuals can shape historical development while simultaneously revealing the limitations of personal rule in addressing systemic problems. Her remarkable intelligence, political skill, and cultural sophistication enable unprecedented achievements, while her human flaws and compromises create problems that outlive her reign. European perceptions of Russia undergo fundamental transformation during Catherine's reign as the empire evolves from peripheral curiosity to central participant in continental affairs. The intellectual recognition that accompanies military and diplomatic success establishes Russia's claim to European civilization while creating expectations for continued modernization that will influence future imperial development. The geographical scope of Catherine's impact extends far beyond Europe, as Russian expansion into Siberia, Central Asia, and the Pacific creates the territorial foundations for a genuinely global empire. Her encouragement of exploration and settlement establishes Russian claims to territories that will prove enormously valuable in subsequent centuries, while creating administrative challenges that test imperial governance capabilities. As Catherine breathes her last on that November evening in 1796, she leaves behind an empire that has been fundamentally transformed during her 34-year reign. The Russia of 1796 bears little resemblance to the state she inherited in 1762, having evolved from a large but peripheral kingdom into a continental empire capable of influencing global affairs. The immediate succession crisis that follows Catherine's death demonstrates both the strength and fragility of the institutional changes she has implemented. While the empire survives the transition to Paul I's erratic rule, the political instability that characterizes his reign reveals how dependent imperial success has become on individual leadership rather than systematic governance. The long-term consequences of Catherine's reign extend far beyond the Romanov period to influence Russian development through the Soviet era and into the present. The territorial boundaries she establishes largely survive until 1991, while the institutional framework she creates provide foundations for subsequent modernization efforts. Her demonstration that Russia can compete successfully with other great powers establishes national confidence that survives political upheavals and military defeats. The empress, who once sought merely to survive as a foreign usurper, ultimately transforms herself into the architect of modern Russian greatness, leaving a legacy that continues shaping international affairs more than 2 centuries after her death. The philosophical transformation of Russian political thought during Catherine's reign creates intellectual foundations that will influence imperial governance for more than a century after her death. Her synthesis of Enlightenment rationalism with autocratic necessity establishes a uniquely Russian approach to modernization that attempts to combine Western ideas with Eastern political traditions. This intellectual framework provides justification for subsequent reforms while maintaining the autocratic structures that Catherine believes essential for governing such a vast and diverse empire. The Empress's correspondence with European intellectuals, totaling over 15,000 letters preserved in imperial archives, creates a documentary record of unprecedented scope that reveals the evolution of her thinking from idealistic reformer to pragmatic conservative. These letters demonstrate how a genuinely intelligent ruler grapples with the enormous gap between Enlightenment theory and political reality, ultimately developing a philosophy of gradual change that influences Russian liberalism for generations. Catherine's impact on Russian Orthodox Christianity proves particularly complex and enduring as she transforms the Church from a potential rival to imperial authority into a pillar of state power while simultaneously protecting religious minorities and promoting secular education. Her secularization of monastery lands provides resources for social programs while reducing clerical political influence, establishing precedents for church-state relations that survive until the Bolshevik Revolution. The development of Russian national identity accelerates dramatically during Catherine's reign as imperial expansion and cultural achievements create new sources of pride and confidence among educated Russians. The Empress, who arrives as a German outsider, ultimately becomes the architect of modern Russian nationalism by demonstrating that their empire can compete successfully with any European power in military prowess, diplomatic sophistication, and cultural achievement. Educational innovations under Catherine establish institutional frameworks for intellectual development that survive political upheavals throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. The university curricula she approves, the scholarly societies she sponsors, and the libraries she creates provide resources for subsequent generations of Russian thinkers who will contribute to European philosophy, literature, and science. A recognition that imperial greatness requires intellectual achievement as well as military power influences educational policy throughout the Romanov period. The economic policies implemented during Catherine's reign create commercial relationships and industrial foundations that transform Russia from a primarily agricultural society into an increasingly diversified economy capable of supporting great power ambitions. Our encouragement of foreign investment and technical expertise establishes patterns of economic development that accelerate during the 19th century, while her promotion of domestic manufacturing creates the beginnings of Russian industrial capability. Military innovations during Catherine's reign established tactical and organizational principles that influence Russian armed forces well into the modern era. The emphasis on professional training, technological innovation, and strategic planning creates military traditions that enable Russia to defeat Napoleon and play decisive roles in subsequent European conflicts. A general's writings on warfare become standard texts in European military academies, demonstrating Russian contributions to the science of war. Architectural achievements during Catherine's reign create visual symbols of Russian greatness that continue shaping national identity and international perception centuries after their construction. The palaces, public buildings, and urban planning projects commissioned during her reign establish St. Petersburg and other imperial cities as competitors to Paris, Vienna, and London in grandeur and sophistication. These architectural monuments serve as permanent testimonies to the cultural achievements of her era. The development of Russian literature and arts accelerates dramatically during Catherine's reign as increased patronage and expanded educational opportunities create the conditions for unprecedented cultural flowering. While the greatest achievements of Russian literature occur after her death, the institutional foundations and cultural confidence established during her reign make possible the works of Pushkin, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky that will earn Russia recognition as a major contributor to world culture. International diplomatic precedents established during Catherine's reign influence European politics throughout the 19th century as her successful combination of military power with skillful negotiation becomes a model for subsequent Russian leaders. Her demonstration that coalition building and careful timing can achieve objectives that military force alone cannot accomplish establishes diplomatic traditions that serve Russian interests through multiple international crises. The integration of non-Russian populations during Catherine's reign creates administrative models for governing multi-ethnic empires that influence not only Russian policy but also practices adopted by other European powers managing diverse colonial territories. Her policies of cultural autonomy, combined with political integration, demonstrate how large empires can maintain unity while accommodating diversity, establishing precedents that remain relevant in contemporary discussions of federal governance. Scientific exploration and geographic discovery accelerate during Catherine's reign as increased resources and systematic planning extend Russian knowledge of Siberian and Pacific territories while contributing to global understanding of previously unknown regions. The expeditions she sponsors establish Russian claims to territories that prove enormously valuable in subsequent centuries, while advancing scientific knowledge in fields ranging from botany to anthropology. The development of Russian historical consciousness during Catherine's reign establishes narrative frameworks for understanding national development that influence identity formation for generations. Her encouragement of historical research and writing creates scholarly traditions that celebrate Russian achievements while acknowledging foreign influences, establishing a balanced perspective on national development that avoids both excessive chauvinism and cultural self-deprecation. Women's roles in imperial society expand significantly during Catherine's reign, as her own example demonstrates. Female capacity for political leadership, while her policies create new opportunities for aristocratic women's participation in cultural and intellectual life. The precedents established during her reign influence subsequent debates about women's education, legal rights, and social roles, contributing to gradual improvements in gender equality that continue throughout the imperial period. Urban planning and development accelerate during Catherine's reign as increased prosperity and population growth create demands for improved infrastructure and expanded commercial facilities. The cities that flourish under her guidance become models for subsequent urban development throughout the empire, establishing patterns of growth that accommodate both commercial activity and cultural institutions while maintaining the architectural grandeur appropriate to imperial capitals. Legal scholarship and jurisprudence develop systematically during Catherine's reign as her codification efforts stimulate academic interest in comparative law and constitutional theory. Russian legal thinkers begin contributing to European discussions of governmental structure and individual rights, establishing intellectual traditions that influence reform movements throughout the 19th century. Her legal writings, while incomplete, provide foundations for subsequent efforts to establish rule of law within autocratic systems. The expansion of commercial relationships during Catherine's reign creates economic networks that connect Russian producers with global markets while establishing trade patterns that survive political upheavals and military conflicts. The commercial treaties negotiated during her reign provide frameworks for economic cooperation that benefit Russian development while demonstrating the empire's reliability as a trading partner for European and Asian merchants. Colonial administration develops systematically during Catherine's reign as territorial expansion requires new approaches to governing distant territories with diverse populations and economic systems. The administrative structures created for managing newly acquired territories establish precedents for subsequent expansion into Central Asia and the Far East, demonstrating Russian capacity for effective imperial governance across enormous distances and cultural boundaries. The development of transportation and communication infrastructure accelerates during Catherine's reign as military necessities and administrative requirements stimulate investment in roads, canals, and postal systems that connect previously isolated regions with imperial centers. These infrastructure improvements facilitate economic development while strengthening political control, establishing patterns of investment that continue throughout the imperial period. Scientific institutions established during Catherine's reign create research capabilities that contribute to both practical development and theoretical knowledge, establishing Russia as a participant in European scientific networks rather than merely a consumer of foreign innovations. The Academy of Sciences expands its research programs while new institutions focus on applied sciences that support military and economic development, creating intellectual resources that benefit subsequent generations. Cultural exchange with European centers accelerates during Catherine's reign as increased prosperity and political stability enable more Russians to study abroad, while attracting foreign scholars, artists, and technicians to Russian institutions. This intellectual exchange enriches Russian culture while contributing to European understanding of Russian achievements, creating networks of communication that survive political tensions and military conflicts. The transformation of noble culture during Catherine's reign creates social expectations and behavioral patterns that influence aristocratic development throughout the imperial period. Her emphasis on education, cultural sophistication, and public service establishes standards for noble conduct that gradually replace purely military traditions with more diverse forms of social contribution, creating a more versatile and capable ruling class. Regional development accelerates during Catherine's reign as improved administration and increased investment stimulate economic growth in previously neglected territories. The policies implemented in New Russia and other frontier regions demonstrate how systematic planning can transform underdeveloped areas into prosperous provinces, establishing models for subsequent territorial development throughout the empire. As historians continue studying Catherine's reign centuries after her death, new evidence and analytical frameworks reveal additional dimensions of her impact on Russian and European development. Recent scholarship emphasizes her role as a modernizing autocrat whose policies established foundations for continued imperial expansion, while creating institutional frameworks that survived multiple political upheavals. Her reign emerges not merely as a period of territorial conquest, but as a fundamental transformation of Russian society that influences development patterns well into the modern era. The complexity of Catherine's legacy reflects the enormous challenges facing any leader attempting to modernize traditional societies while maintaining political stability and cultural continuity. Her partial successes and significant failures provide insights into the dynamics of historical change that remain relevant for understanding contemporary political development in Russia and other societies grappling with similar challenges. The empress who sought to transform Russia through enlightened governance ultimately demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of reform from above, leaving a mixed legacy that continues generating scholarly debate and political discussion more than 2 centuries after her remarkable reign concluded. Catherine the Great's death in November 1796 marked the end of one of history's most remarkable reigns, but the transformation she accomplished continued reshaping not just Russia, but the entire global balance of power for generations to come. The German princess who had arrived in Moscow as an uncertain bride had evolved into an empress whose territorial conquests, administrative innovations, and cultural achievements established Russia as a permanent great power capable of influencing events from Europe to Asia to North America. Her legacy encompasses profound contradictions that reflect the enormous challenges of governing the world's largest empire while attempting to implement Enlightenment ideals within autocratic structures. Catherine genuinely believed in human dignity, legal equality, and rational governance, yet she simultaneously expanded serfdom, suppressed popular uprisings, and maintained absolute power. These contradictions reveal the practical impossibility of reconciling philosophical idealism with political reality in 18th century conditions. The territorial expansion under Catherine's rule, adding over 200,000 square miles, including Crimea, southern Ukraine, and eastern Poland, created the geographical foundations for Russian power that endured until the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. More importantly, her administrative reforms and cultural achievements transformed Russia from a medieval autocracy into a recognizably modern state capable of competing with other European powers in diplomacy, warfare, and civilization. Catherine's greatest failure, her inability to address serfdom as fundamental injustices, ultimately proved more historically significant than her remarkable successes. The social contradictions she left unresolved would generate revolutionary pressures that eventually destroyed the imperial system she worked so hard to strengthen. Yet even this failure illuminates the enormous challenges facing any ruler attempting to modernize traditional societies without triggering revolutionary upheaval. The empress who began her reign reading Voltaire and dreaming of enlightened reform concluded it defending traditional authority against democratic revolution. This evolution from idealistic reformer to pragmatic conservative reflects broader European responses to the French Revolution, while demonstrating how political survival often requires abandoning philosophical consistency. Catherine's influence on subsequent Russian development proved immeasurable as the institutional frameworks she created, the territorial boundaries she established, and the international precedents she set continued shaping imperial policy throughout the 19th century and beyond. A demonstration that Russia could achieve greatness through systematic modernization, rather than mere military force, established patterns of development that influenced leaders from Alexander I through Vladimir Putin. The German princess, who transformed herself into Catherine the Great, ultimately transformed Russia itself, creating the foundations for a continental empire whose influence continues shaping global affairs more than 2 centuries after her remarkable reign concluded. Her story remains the most dramatic example of how individual vision and determination can reshape the destiny of nations and continents.